It's lovely here in the West Coast. Hope that's the same as East Coast. This is a virtual conference with people joining in from all over. And we have a very esteemed guest today. We have 4 speakers and panel moderator, Mitchell Levy, who have an open conversation towards the second half of the conference. And we're going to show you the agenda here. Insha, you want to show the agenda? It's lined up from 11 to 2. It's 30 minutes each for the speakers. We have a quick 5-minute break for the bio. After that, there's another session and then the panel with Mitchell. And after that, we'll do the survey and conclusion. Thanks for joining. And for the housekeeping purpose, please continue to chat like I'm seeing right now. And if you have any questions, there's a Q&A button at the top or at the bottom left that you can ask for the speakers or for the panelists. We're welcome to do so. We'll try to reply with the text itself while the speaker is speaking. And if there's any question for the speaker, I will urge that to the speaker to help answer. And then if we don't cover all the questions, then you'll get the opportunity during the panel, which is after the break. So the first, for the introduction purpose, Project Management World, if you don't already know, it's a professional association with over 1,500 members. It has the main purpose and the mission is to further the careers of existing project managers, program managers, and project coordinators. This was 4 organizations that have been going on since 2004, and they all merged together in 2014. And these are members helping members in multiple industries. So there are events, about dozens of the events per year, such as this one, totally organized by the volunteers. And we also have the courses, which are on-site, live webinars, and also self-study. And then there are resources like textbooks and white paper. And in this particular event, we're going to be sending white paper to all the attendees, which I'll show later the details of that. And then the presence is also there on the PM World Meetup, as well as the LinkedIn group. You can see the website here. And then the survey, when we do the survey, you'll see that in the chat section as well. So that's the introduction for Project Management World. And we can start with our first speaker, Ravi. Ravi Acharya, he's with the Hologic in the medical or healthcare industry. And he's been in the R&D project manager. And he's going to talk about the significance of artificial intelligence. How does that help in the healthcare industry? And then at the end of his speaking session, if there are a few minutes left, we'll answer a few questions. And then before we go to our next speaker, so feel free to chat, feel free to ask questions during the presentation in the Q&A, and we'll take that up. So I'll tee that up to Ravi. Ravi, hope you can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Raj. Thank you, Raj, for your generous introduction. Good morning to everyone here in the West Coast, and good afternoon to everyone in the East Coast. Thanks for joining. It's good to be here. And thanks for taking time out of your Saturday to listen to me and listen to all the panelists today. So my name is Ravi Acharya. I'm a R&D project manager at Hologic under the breast and skeletal health. And I'm primarily leading AI case collection project within Hologic. I have primarily been a project manager for about 5 years now, primarily been working in healthcare, and in the recent days, primarily been working in the medical device industry. So to start off my presentation for the day, is actually I thought this session is more of an interactive session that I could like kind of see all the audience and all that, but it's okay. So I just wanted to start off asking the audience here, how many of you are PM? I'll just give you like a minute to answer in the chat box, and then kind of get started from there. You could just say yes, PM. Okay, great. Software program manager, PM. All right. Awesome. Okay. PM a while ago. Great. Awesome. All right. So it looks like pretty much everyone's in PM or trying to get into PM. So that's great. My next question for you all is like, how many of you are familiar with the healthcare domain? Just write your answer. Are you familiar? Okay, familiar. Okay, moderately. Okay. Okay, great. Very familiar. That's awesome. Mhm. Okay. Often over many years in R&D. Great. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. Awesome. Okay. This gives me a heads up that few of us in the audience are quite familiar with the healthcare side of things. So that's great. Okay. Dinshaw, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay. So when I ask you to think about healthcare, what can you think about? What is the first thing that comes in your mind? Answer. Expensive. Okay. Right. It's expensive. Right. Telehealth. Awesome. Drugs. Not available to everyone. Right. Health. No saving. HIPAA. PHI. Oh yeah. Good stuff. Sensors. opaque. Security. Preventative, reactive, widely variable, consolidated industry. Absolutely. Doctor's advice. Yeah. Okay. All right. Can we continue, Denso? Okay. Yeah, we definitely think about healthcare professionals. We think about hospitals. We think about pharmacy. Someone mentioned about expensiveness. That's insurance. We talked about medical device, pharmaceuticals. Anyone here think about project manager when you think about healthcare? Yes, definitely. Perfect. All right. I'd like to start my presentation today with some of the prominent healthcare AI projects that's out there in development and what's being done in that regard. So the first one is improving patient outcome, right? There are like a lot of projects out there that are trying to work into predicting the health of a person in a longer generation of time. Say you have anomaly in a blood report, right? What does that mean? What kind of diseases can you get in the future, right? There are a lot of AI projects out there doing EKG research, which is about predicting. Okay, sure. Predicting about whether or not you're getting heart disease in the future, and things like that, right? And the second one is like streamlining radiology reporting diagnosis, right? Using like MRI, ultrasound, right? There's like AI technology being used to predict, for example, when the child is born, how the child is born, what is the position of the child in the womb, you know, and all that regards in terms of predicting what might be the best sort of treatment procedure going forward, right? The third one is early cancer detection, which is a really big one right now about feeding data. So when I mean data, I mean about patient information. It could be like images, it could be reports, it could be doctor notes, whatever it is, you know, kind of feeding that into AI so that there is a predictability about whether or not you're getting cancer and things like that. Another big AI project within healthcare is the robotic surgeries. There are like prominent examples in that regards to like doing a knee surgery, a robot doing a knee surgery, right? I mean, there's definitely physicians, orthopedic surgeons who are involved in the surgery, but it's more about helping them with the manual tasks like cutting, stitching, and all that, which is kind of groundbreaking in terms of how things are moving towards implementing AI projects into the surgical side of things as well. And there's another prominent AI project that's kind of been used for digital drug discovery. I guess this is quite relevant with COVID as well. I was just reading a few days ago about Pfizer coming out with a pill, which is almost same like that kind of works similar to the vaccine that we have going on right now, which is kind of developed from the 3D cloud-based digital drug discovery program, which is heavily powered by AI and data and things like that. The sixth one here is there could be projects leading towards automating the repetitive administrative tasks. Like you get a lot of medical record information, you got to compile it together, you got to store it somewhere, right? Those kind of tasks could be automated in a process where it could be easier for the physician first, and it could be it could aid in terms of their treatment overall. And there's another field of personalized medicine, which is big thing right now, which kind of relates to probably you've heard about companies like 23andMe kind of predicting what might you be prone to get in your lifetime if you have anything in your gene and things like that. So yeah, let's go to the next slide then, Shah. Okay, what's unique about being a healthcare PM, right? So, I mean, in a regular PM setting, you're just more concerned about how are you going to be managing cost, how are you going to deliver things, right? Kind of managing people, managing change, and all that, right? But when I kind of think more into the healthcare side of the project management side of within the healthcare, what I think about is every decision I make today is some or the other how kind of making an impact in someone's life at some level. So it's really critical that every decision I make has an impact on someone and the quality of care. Example for that could be like I'm developing device, right? It could be a stent. So just giving an example, right? So I just need to be making sure that when I design the product, when I kind of bring that out development phase and whatever that is, I gotta make sure that I have that patient in my mind, and every decision I make should be driving the process overall. So quality of care is really crucial when you become a healthcare PM. And another aspect of it is like I am obligated to a lot of governmental and regulatory policies, because since the healthcare industry is a regulated market, and myself being in an AI project lead, I am dealing with a lot of data. When I mean data, I'm leading with a lot of patient information, and the patient information is the private information, and there are a lot of privacy and things like that I need to be really careful about when I'm like kind of tackling things in common. So I am obligated to like HIPAA. Being in medical device, I'm highly regulated by FDA, and I got to make sure that I comply with all the CE mark and 510K submission for both the US and the European market, which is kind of critical. And unique in a sense that you need to be aware of all the policies, regulatory policy, and how do you kind of implement change based on the regulatory changes that keeps happening periodically. The other aspect of it is like the cost management. The audit is key, and there are a lot of audits happening. There are like first party, second party, third party audits that's going on a regular basis. So it's really critical for you as a healthcare PM to manage projects simultaneously when audits are going on as well. And the fourth part is I know as a regular PM, we kind of manage like a lot of different budgets and things like that. But primarily in the medical device and the healthcare industry, budgeting is a little complex just because there are like government and private peer involved. What I really mean by that is a lot of the R&D development stuff is more tied up to like research organizations. So you might be receiving funds from NIH, NCBI, lot of this organization, and there could be like university research kind of involved. So managing that budget is a very complex situation, just because that you got to account to a lot of government and private peers, which play kind of key role in terms of executing the project within the healthcare industry. So the fifth biggest point and the unique point about being a healthcare PM is more towards like the deliverables and the metrics are different, right? So on a regular PM task, you kind of measure how the task has been completed. What is the end to closure date? You can see like what your earned value is, what your actual value is, right? Those are primary key metrics we kind of keep account to, seeing how things are going in the project, right? And you gotta also go with like CPIs and stuff like that. But in healthcare, when I'm kind of measuring the metrics, I mean, I definitely have that PM side of metrics that I can measure for my internal processes and things like that. But I'm more concerned and more things to explore kind of around seeing the bigger picture about what's going on. So I kind of keep account to how many people's life can this thing save. I might look into how can this processes kind of improve the recovery time for a patient, right? Those are a little different kind of metrics I kind of follow when I'm like executing a decision and things like that. And it could also be like, how can like incidents for complaint reporting can be decreased and things like that, right? So it's not just the regular framed matrix as a PM I kind of use in my day-to-day life. It's more about having the bigger picture and seeing how things kind of move on. The sixth biggest point here is that you need to be able to collaborate with both healthcare professionals, providers, and technical teams as a PM in the healthcare. Because I can just give you an example. Like I work in an AI case collection project, right? So when I kind of bring this up, I need to be able to communicate the information I need from a radiologist, kind of transfer that to my IT folks and make sure everyone is kind of aligned together. What are the needs, like defining the requirements and things like that. So is this session being recorded and we'll have access to the presentation? Yeah, sure. This is being recorded, I guess, right, Denshaw? Is that right? There's a question there.
Yes, Ravi.
Okay, great. And feel free to ask me if you have any questions as I'm going through as well. That's I'll be happy to. I'll be more than happy to answer it. And
yeah, so Ravi, there are a couple of questions.
Oh, sure.
So you may want to get towards the end or now.
Sure.
So there's one in the Q&A section is, how does he manage the conference record? Oh, sorry. Which methodology does Ravi use to track progress and measure metrics?
Okay, so mostly we use waterfall methodology to track progress and measure metrics. It's more very process oriented, right? I'll kind of go more in detail later on about how the AI journey for a case collection kind of looks like. So I'll get to that. And how does he manage compliance requirement and knowledge needed? So the compliance requirement is kind of based on SOPs, mostly in the medical device industry. And you just got to be compliant towards having how the regulatory bodies have kind of set about what the different requirements are and how you kind of move forward. And there's a lot of layers within the internal and the external team about knowing what's kind of needed in terms of the requirement and what can be executed and what not. So it just all kind of depends on situational perspective about how the compliance requirement is kind of managed overall. How does communication differentiate from other projects? I would say communication would kind of differ. I mean, primarily in healthcare, mostly because you're kind of working with like different entities within the system, right? You might be, like as I mentioned, you might be working with a physician, you might be working with the IT folks. You just got to be sure that you kind of understand the processes and then drive the decision towards how things can be outlined more so. Okay, I'll continue with my presentation now. So critical project management skill for an healthcare AI project manager includes communication. That's an important one. Communication is key. You got to communicate with your steering committee. You got to communicate with your internal team. You got to, internal stakeholders, the steering, it could be the radiologist, it could be the clinical researcher, it could be your solution architect and all those people. And there needs to be a constant way of communicating within the teams, which is kind of hard at times because oftentimes there are possible chances of being derailed in terms of how the information is flown to you and how it's kind of managed overall. A particular thing about the healthcare, being a healthcare AI project manager is having the domain knowledge. You gotta know how you kind of manage data. You gotta know what HIPAA is. You gotta know what HL7 is. You got to know how do you comply with the regulatory bodies, right? And things like that, because having some domain knowledge in healthcare is really critical in terms of how you execute your plans. How do you kind of set your goal and so on. And the other critical part is about managing the stakeholder. Like, as I mentioned, I might have a lot of people in the team. I could have people mostly because it's since the AI is powered by data and data needs to be collected from somewhere, and not everyone has that data. So there are a protocol of things that needs to be kind of maintained to make sure that it's kind of aligned together to all the requirements, and make sure that all the people in your team is kind of aligned together. So okay, sure, I'm okay, got it. Trying to make sure that. Okay, I'll definitely come back to the question later on. So I'd like to go now with the healthcare AI journey, which is about, you have research, you have collection, you have intake, curation, and development, right? So in the research part, it's more about finding site, where can you get data from, figuring out what kind of data you need, what kind of model you're trying to build, and things of that sort. And then you have the collection piece of it, where you have like clinical exams, kind of identifying where the data are, what are your requirements, setting up the requirements. And there's an intake process to it, where since we are in the healthcare industry, we are very, very, very conservative about how we intake the data, because a lot of personal health information is kind of included in the PHI. So we as a PM got to make sure that all the information in the PHI is kind of removed, redacted, and nothing of personal information is being used towards being able to drive the decision overall. So intake is also the process where the data has been transferred over from a site to whatever company or things like that you're kind of working on. And there's a curation aspect of it, which is more towards like matching whether the data is kind of matched up to what your AI system is going to be trained in, or making sure. I can give you an example for like cancer research model, which is about the curation needs to take place where like you got to match the requirements, saying that I need like malignant cases, benign cases, a recall case with certain modalities like ultrasound and all that. So I got to really match the data requirement into the curation phase of things before we kind of move into the development. And then there's the final stage of development where you kind of feed all the information you have to an AI, which kind of leads to a modeling about the predictability of any disease or condition that that kind of make overall lifetime impact and so on. So this is cancer detection model. There's an AI in the centerpiece, and basically patient reports, doctor reports, the ultrasound images, and everything is kind of fed in, and that's how the modeling basically works. Next slide, please. Okay, I have a small video I'm going to share with you. Dinsha, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, sure. Can you play that? So this is an AI for Health program by Microsoft. Let's watch this and we'll get back to it.
It's the symbiotic relationship between the human and machine that brings the magic of AI to medicine in a meaningful way.
Now we have the tools to make a huge difference to human life.
Cancer research is increasingly powered by data. Those data remain siloed across institutions.
We're creating a data ecosystem that allows people to share data and making sure that we're doing that in a way that still maintains the privacy of the patients.
With the power of AI, we can go after the unknown. And I can guarantee that we'll find something that nobody expected.
Silent-Van syndrome scares every mother and father, and it is a problem we have to change. The collaboration with Microsoft AI for Health will help to start this next step of our discovery. Our data show very convincingly clear correlation between smoking and SIDS, and just changing behavior can save children's lives. You cannot measure the benefit of that.
It's a sad day when the patient comes in and I can't impact them.
Through AI for Health, we will be building an AI solution that can autonomously diagnose diabetic retinopathy.
With the portable camera, I can take healthcare to the patients who would not be able to come to us. I want you to look right here.
Going forward, we can address the 500 million patients that are out there and disrupt this disease. AI for Health and IRIS together can have that impact.
Today, there are 200,000 leprosy patients diagnosed every year. If you catch it in the stage of a skin lesion, you can cure the person. We are teaching an AI algorithm to recognize leprosy in an image of a skin lesion.
With AI, we can help patients help themselves to get to the right experts at the right time. If you can help a child to not lose their fingers, that means everything.
Innovation comes from bringing different perspectives together. And what an amazing partnership this is for all of us.
When you see that you can make a big impact on somebody's life, that's the greatest thing ever.
We can help eliminate the oldest disease known to man and make history. That's how we want to contribute to the world.
All right, so AI for health, AI for good. There are a lot of things out there, and there are a lot of discussion whether AI is good or bad. But if you talked about AI in healthcare, it's more about good than for anything worse. So I'd like to close up with my presentation with a quote. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is a quote by Klaus Schwab. He says, "We must address individually and collectively moral and ethical issues raised by cutting-edge research in artificial intelligence and biotechnology, which will enable significant life extension, designer babies, and memory extraction." So this is all for it. And that's about it for my presentation. Thanks everyone for listening. I'll get back to you with Q&A later. Up to you, Raj.
Thank you, Ravi. This is really inspiring and opening Saturday morning here. Healthcare that touches all of us, and answering a few of the questions. And before we get to it. So for the next speaker, we have a esteemed guest, Patrick Bangert from Samsung. He's the Vice President of AI, and he leads the AI engineering and AI sciences team at Samsung, specifically what is called Brightex AI Accelerator, which is a distributed machine learning training and automated ML. Samsung has over 15 years of experience before that as a CEO of Algorithmica Technologies. And his PhD is in mathematics and master's in theoretical physics from University of College London. Also, I'm pleased to share that he was also nominated as the top 20 influencers in the AI. So very, very pleased to have you, Patrick.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here today. I'm going to talk about the workflow of data science, and I will try to say a few connecting pieces to what my esteemed colleague Ravi talked about just before. So to begin with, let me just begin by saying what is required in order to do AI for anything, any topic. So in my opinion and experience, it's really these 7 steps here that are needed in a project. There are 5 steps in the middle here that are technical steps that involve, computer programs and mathematics and all that sort of good stuff that we think about when we hear artificial intelligence. And there are 2 steps at the very beginning and very end that are not technical. They're human topics where we need to communicate with people. So that's one of the important things to realize, is that AI projects are projects that need project management, which involves at the very beginning this communication step here, where we discover together with all the other stakeholders, what is it that we're trying to solve here? What is the desired outcome? How can we measure whether or not the outcome is in some sense good, or has in some sense solved the initial problem? And then at the very end, there comes a change management step where users of whatever we make have to be willing and able to actually use what we've made. Your AI model in and of itself is useless and valueless. It only provides value if it's being used by human beings for some purpose. So these people have to be put in a position to use it, and that usually involves a number of steps that have nothing to do with artificial intelligence. It has to do with how that's packaged, how the user interface looks and feels, how that user interface is accessible to the end user, matching their technological pre-education or ability. Now, the middle 5 steps here are what I'm mostly going to focus on, because those are the technical aspects that are called artificial intelligence. After you've cleared out with communication what it is that you're doing, the first step is to acquire data. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are areas that really focus on the computer performing some sort of learning activity based on data. So it's just like people going to school. If you went to school and the school didn't have a teacher or textbooks, you would have trouble. You would, if you would learn at all, you would learn much slower, and you would probably learn less. So having a teacher, having textbooks available is an essential part of human learning, and it's the same for artificial intelligence. It needs data to learn from, so you have to collect that. But the data, of course, has to be relevant to the task that you want it to perform, just like in human school. If you supply students with math books and then give them a literature exam, that's not going to help. So you need clean data in the sense that the data has to be representative and statistically significant about the problem that you're solving. And that's really the aspect of data labeling, where you have to enter human domain knowledge to the data set in order to make sure that it is clean and that the information that you want to finally extract is there to train from. So this connects well with what Robbie was talking about earlier in medicine. You need typically human doctors who are very knowledgeable and educated about a particular disease to add that diagnostic information to data for the AI to be able to then produce something like a diagnosis or a treatment plan for a disease that it detects. Just merely photographs aren't going to do it. Then we proceed with pure math here, really, where we generate features, which is to figure out those aspects of the data set that are most informative about the task that we're trying to solve. Then tuning the model to the task, choosing, are we going to use a neural network, a decision tree, a support vector machine, whatever? What's the learning rate? What's the batch size? All of these mathematical parameters need to be chosen and tuned to the data set that we've got. Finally, having done that, we train the model for real and we make it available at what's called inference. Inference is the term that we use when we've made the model and it's being productively used in some sort of deployment case. And then finally, the change management step that I talked about. You have to convince people to actually do the inference that you've made available. So these are the steps. Now, it turns out, of course, if you formulate the wrong problem or you formulate the problem badly, then the rest of the workflow will pretty much fail. So a lot of the frustration in doing an AI task happens at the very beginning when we ask, what is the problem and what does the solution even look like? However, the risk really occurs at the end, at the change management step. So in my personal experience, I would say that about 8 out of 10 AI projects fail, and they fail because of change management, and a 9th out of 10 fails because of bad communication at the very beginning. If you look across the landscape of AI models that are made, it is pretty much a universal observation that 1 out of 10 AI models that are made that are accurate are actually used productively and provide some sort of financial value to somebody at the end of the day. So it is not mathematics or computer programs or technology that are responsible for AI project failures. It is the management of these projects that is responsible for that. And as I say, 9 out of 10 projects that are concluded up to this point, actually having a model that does work, fail because of organizational issues. So that's a real clear and present problem that we have. Beyond that, the distribution of labor is not the same throughout this process. It is the data-related activities, both the acquisition and the labeling and cleaning of the data set, that consume the vast majority of the human labor. The next 3 steps are then mostly computer labor, which means they don't consume our human time, but they consume time nonetheless. So it delays the project. For realistic size data sets, you can expect this kind of research activity to generate the right features, to select the models and tune the hyperparameters and do the actual training. You can easily believe that this takes 3, 4, 5 months of computing time. So these projects, despite what some newspapers indicate, are actually quite time consuming from beginning to end. So they are not projects where you kind of push the button and at the end of the weekend you have a fantastic result. That is unfortunately not real life. Now, what I do want to make you aware of as potentially a project manager in AI or a future project manager in AI is that some of these tasks can be automated and some of the risks can be mitigated. And that's what I want to spend a few minutes talking about. The first task here is really concerning the step in the beginning where we label data. In other words, where we inject the human domain knowledge into the data. This is a technique called active learning, where we simply observe that labeling data, which for a lot of the problems that we encounter in real life happens to be image data, where we want to draw a bounding box or indicate some boundary. Here, this is a healthcare example that relates well to the previous talk, where we identify the location of a disease. In this case, that's COVID-19, where Samsung did some good work in detecting and diagnosing it. These labels take time to make, but the order in which you label your images matters very significantly. Typically, we label the images in the order that they were taken in, basically a random order. But if we were to label them in the order of the information that they provide to the final AI model, we would be much better off. Of course, we don't know what that order is, and so it sounds like an oxymoron, but it isn't, because there is a technique in artificial intelligence called active learning, which discovers that order as we go along. So the idea is quite simply this. We start by labeling a small amount of the data, providing it to the active learning system, which then learns what it can, reorders the remaining images, and provides the most uncertain ones back to us. We label them, give it back, and we proceed in a back and forth fashion like this with the active learning system, and always labeling the most informative images next. And that leads to a greater convergence. You see on the picture here, this is an average example. As I said, detecting COVID on these lung X-ray images that I showed. The blue curve here is the accuracy that the model gains as you label the images in a random order. And you can see the accuracy is all over the place. It doesn't necessarily grow monotonically over time. However, if you label the images using this technique, active learning, your accuracy grows and grows quite quickly and reaches the absolute maximum already after 16% of the images are labeled, which means the other 84% of the data set does not need to be labeled by a human being anymore. It can be automatically labeled, by the active learning step. In other words, you have a vast labor reduction of 84%. And if you think that in a realistic case, it is expensive and rare doctors that have to label hundreds of thousands of images, you are literally reducing the project cost by millions. Now that's one example. Feature generation is another example where you can automate the process. Here we were really looking for parts of the data set that are most informative about the situation, and the other parts are not. So you're effectively trying to come up with a map in multidimensional space, of course, that distinguishes from a haphazard categorization that you have initially to a structured categorization that is much easier to characterize by an AI later. So for example, if you want to distinguish here, in this case, dogs and chairs, both dogs and chairs have legs, and each one of them, typically speaking, have 4 legs. That's not always the case, of course, and certainly not always in a photograph do they have 4 legs, but it's typical. But the legs look different, right? Chair legs and dog's legs are not quite the same. So a picture, a sub-picture of a dog's leg or a chair's leg are probably most informative about which one it is. So that's obviously a silly example, but you get the idea that representative parts of a picture are a feature. And selecting them in an intelligent way that they are most informative is a task that can also be automated by techniques that you can Google under the word unsupervised feature learning. I won't go into depth what that actually entails. It would take too much time. But let's go on and say model selection and hyperparameter tuning. So model selection, there is an entire zoo of possible models out there for your task, and it is completely unclear a priori which one is best. Typically, people choose based on their gut feeling, which is obviously not very scientific. The only other option you have is trial and error, which means I'm going to try this model, I'm going to try that model, and basically pick the best one out of the ones that I've had time to try. And so time starts becoming a real problem because you can't try them all. So you need some sort of halfway intelligent way of doing this. What could that be? Hang on to that thought, because we need to do the same thing for the hyperparameters of that model. What is the learning rate, momentum, and so on going to be? Again, you can try a few and pick the best one. That is not the smartest way to search. How should we search? Well, typically people search for the right model and the right parameters by putting a grid structure on the possible values. So it then looks like this. Supposing you have 2 parameters to pick from, the vertical one and the horizontal one, you basically lay out a grid like this, you evaluate at all points, and you pick the best one. Now, this approach, of course, comes from design of experiment, and it is a reasonable historical approach from the point of view that it is necessary to plan your experiments before you have any results from the experiments. Now, in a physical laboratory, doing a chemistry exam and so on, that might be wise and necessary. But in computer experiments, where there are no safety factors involved, that is actually a pretty bad way to plan. We should do an adaptive search, which searches in a few random locations to begin with, but then can calculate the optimal point to search next. And you can see by the pattern here upstairs, here the grid pattern evaluated at 3 points, but the really good point, this one down here, that was never found because it was never tested. Now the adaptive search hones in automatically on the interesting features of the landscape and does, of course, end up finding the good point down there in the valley. So this is how to do it. And then that means you can automate both the finding of the right model as well as the finding of the right parameters to train that model. Lastly, but certainly not leastly, to mention that in order to get all of this trial and error process done and done efficiently, you need to somehow be fast. Now, the time it takes to do these things is somewhat preordained by the size of your data set and the difficulty of your task, and of course, relative to the financial budget that you have to buy yourself the right computers to do this. But it is possible to speed this whole thing up in a distributed fashion. Distributed training simply means I'm going to use more than one computer to do one task. The question is it worth it? And the answer quite simply is, oh yeah. Because imagine that you're back in school and your math teacher asks you the following question. It takes one builder to build a house 100 hours. How long will it take 100 builders to build the same house? Of course, the answer that your math teacher is looking for is it will take 1 day for the 100 builders to build the one house. Now, but anybody who thinks about it would think, hey, 100 builders building a single house, they're going to need management. They're going to need a coordinated plan. People will step on each other's feet, so some people will have to rest. They're going to take actually quite a long time to build that house because of overhead. And typically speaking, the same is true for using multiple computers to do a single job. There is an overhead job involved, and namely the job that plans which computer is going to do what piece of the problem, and that slows the whole thing down. That is true for most so-called workloads for cluster computing. It is not true for artificial intelligence, very curiously, and the reason is very simple. It has to do with the amount of memory that is accessible on each computer. As each computer will have access to a GPU, a graphical processing unit, and basically an NVIDIA graphics card, each one of these cards has a certain amount of memory. So if you pick two computers, it has double the memory. And that has an influence on the batch size that you can use to train with. Ultimately put, very simply, more computers can do more work always without that overhead. And in fact, here's a validation on the screen where we did this for a particularly expensive model, where if you run it on a single computer that has 8 GPUs on it, as compared to 4 or 8 of these machines, the speed goes up by a factor of 3 to 4 machines and a factor of 6 if we go to 8 machines. But you can get another factor of 2 because of that memory point that I talked about, which means in total, a factor of 8 in resources will give you a factor of almost 14 in terms of speed. So that distribution of training that I'm talking about, it's not an academic thing. You can actually do this. And it means that any individual training cycle will actually get financially cheaper as you scale up the resources. So this is how to make all of these steps in an automated way actually take place in realistic time. So ultimately, this is the punchline. I said these two steps here require 80% of the human labor. You can reduce this by at least 50% by using these active learning techniques that I talked about. These 3 steps consume 80% of the time that it takes to get from A to B because of computation time. You can reduce this to essentially whatever extent you want by using the appropriate number of computing resources, because you can make this go very fast if you simply distribute it over a large enough network. And so ultimately, this is my point. If we want to do AI in the real world, whether it is for healthcare applications or others, it is a project. It's a project that entails a number of tasks and a number of risks and a certain amount of work that we need to budget for. So we need to budget, of course, a financial budget, a human resources budget, and a certain amount of time span to get the project done. All of those budgets can be severely reduced if we adopt the right way to get the AI done. And so we've certainly done that. At Samsung, we make these technologies available to others. And just to close the gap between mine and the previous talk, there's a lot of sense to apply this, especially in healthcare, where you are looking at generating very large data sets, many of them image-based, of course, that require the assistance of doctors who should and who would rather be treating patients rather than dealing with data science projects, to speed all that up quite a lot and to get the diagnosis tools and the treatment tools in place at the patient's bedside a lot sooner. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering some of your questions soon.
Thank you, Patrick. This is very educational, and I'm sure we can talk a lot if we had more time. We are ready for the next speaker, but there was one question while you were presenting. Was if the project fails in the beginning of the steps, how does this fall on CM? I need some clarification.
Right, of course, the
project in the chat section.
I'm sorry?
This was in the chat question.
Okay. So of course the project doesn't fail at the first step. That's the problem. It fails much later. It fails later because of the first step, right? So very, very tricky distinction. If it were to fail at the first step, no problem, because no waste has been committed at this point. But if you make a mistake at the very beginning, you formulate the wrong problem. You forget that you need a certain piece of data. You forget to include the right stakeholders. You somehow do not plan enough time, budget, and people for your project. Or the final outcome is defined to be too vague, or you choose a too vague or too unrelated key metric to judge your progress, then at some point in the later parts of the project, you will fail. And you won't know in the beginning that you're going to fail. And that is the problem, because you will now have spent 10 people's time for 6 months and ended up with a solution to a problem nobody ever had.
Makes sense. Thanks. So it's not necessarily at the beginning of the stage, but at later. We have more questions for you, Patrick, but we're going to move to the next, and we'll hold on to the questions. Please keep continuing typing into the Q&A, and we'll have 2 opportunities during the panel discussion as well to bring up those questions for all the speakers. So Patrick, thanks again, and we'll move to the next speaker, Martin Staley. So just a quick introduction. Martin is dialing in from the East Coast, a little bit late for you. Thanks for joining in on a Saturday afternoon. So Martin is the branch chief for strategic technology at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, pretty long name. And he leads the national initiative for the cybersecurity and how the AI is playing a role. He's going to educate us a little bit more on the government side, on the national initiative. And Martin, if you could, the audience is primarily project managers, program managers, and project coordinators, what they can benefit from your, specifically for the cybersecurity, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Hey, how's it going? Having a little bit of an issue getting my slides up. I don't know if they're able to do that for me.
Yeah, we can. If you're not able to, then Chuck can pull it up.
Yep, that'd be awesome. All right, thank you so much. And Patrick, excellent presentation, and the other presenters really good stuff, and I think for the folks that are attending, probably some of the best quality information that you could get. While they're bringing the slides up, I'm going to talk a little bit about my role, what we do at CISA, and some things that are related to artificial intelligence. So I work for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I think most recently, most of you probably would have seen our work, related to election security. Our former director was in the news a lot. But our role is to protect federal networks and critical infrastructure from cyber and physical threats. And within that, obviously, first and foremost, supporting the federal COVID-19 pandemic response is like the number one thing that we're focused on. But other priorities within there are 5G, federal network security, critical infrastructure protection. We engage with a number of sectors through the information sharing and analysis centers, the ISACs that are across the critical infrastructure sectors. I believe there's 16 of them. So big mission. Obviously, the work that we do is critical, very important. But as you're probably well aware, it's so hard with the limited resources that we have, to make more than really a drop in the ocean. So what we are looking at is wherever we can to automate. And our interest in artificial intelligence is to be able to broaden our reach to help our stakeholders. In the CTO office, I run our strategic technology branch. And we look at technology from three perspectives. And I think this is, ties into a lot of what the previous speakers have been saying. We're interested in this technology or any technology as to how that it can help us to meet our mission. And I talked about the things that we're involved in. But related to that is also the way that our stakeholders may adopt these technologies and how these technologies can then, maybe increase the attack surface. And I think as we were going through some of these, projects, we're seeing how the adoption of new technology is really changing the way that a stakeholder could potentially be attacked and the defensive measures that they're going to need to have in place. And then lastly, we look at technology from a perspective of the adversary and how it can enable them. So, we've got a pretty, focused way on the way that we're looking at the use of artificial intelligence. My talk today is on national artificial intelligence initiatives, and I'm going to get to it. But, I think providing a little background as to what we're focused on and why we're interested in this and what these national initiatives mean to us and can mean to you as well is I think a good way to get into it. So I talked about what we do in our CTO office here at CISA. The previous speaker, Patrick, really did a very nice job of talking about the connection of today's topic and dealing with data. I think I saw a study somewhere, and I think Patrick might have mentioned this, that up to 80% of an artificial intelligence project can be related to dealing with data, and we're certainly seeing that. Our agency, obviously, cybersecurity generates a lot of data, and there's a lot of data to go through, and there's a lot of data that needs to be labeled and managed in order to make conclusions. So I think to the extent that you can learn as much as you can about that topic, it will make you a much better project manager. In particular, the things that we do at CISA, we're very closely we're very closely aligned with our chief data officer, and our chief data officer is tied into the federal data strategy. So in addition to some of these things I'm going to be talking about related to artificial intelligence, there's a large federal initiative to deal with data, and I think there's something like 200 tasks over the next 3 or 4 years that are laid out, and many of them are related to making data ready to be used by machine learning or other kinds of AI applications. And I think it's probably also good to talk about AI related technologies. For those of you that are involved in AI projects, you must be, engaged in all kinds of other technologies that are related to artificial intelligence. And I think sometimes we focus too much on the AI aspect of things and maybe not as much around whether it's 5G or IoT, or there's some kind of dependency on hardware, things like that. So really thinking about this broader ecosystem that's evolving and how these transformations are impacting each other is something that dealing with this from a project perspective is very, very challenging. Something that I've learned along the way here after doing some studying, and it comes up in these federal strategies, is public perceptions of AI are very, very interesting. There's a number of studies that have been done, but in particular, my takeaways on reviewing those studies are that people's view of AI, this is the general public, this is people that know things about it, people that don't know things about it. They have very nuanced views of artificial intelligence. It's very use case dependent, and there's a greater concern around the adoption of AI when there can be consequences, real world consequences that affect humans. And so I think for project managers to really understand that as we're dealing with implementing AI, if it's a use case where there can be a real world impact to humans, you should expect that there's going to be a lot more sensitivity, a lot more perception concerns that you're going to have. To that end, one of the first things that we did 2 years ago at CISA was to develop some handy dandy rules of the road for our program managers, because we've got some large programs, to think about the adoption of automated decision systems, of which AI is a category of automated decision systems. And as program managers or project managers, you all manage risk and you're great at it, and there's all kinds of methodologies for managing risk, but it's hard. I personally don't believe that the human brain is wired very well to manage risk. Some of you may agree or disagree with that, but what we did was lay out a 4-dimensional approach to doing the benefit risk analysis with respect to artificial intelligence. So what we look at is your traditional benefit regret, how big is the impact, by automating a lot of analysis, are we going to be able to free up our staff to do work that's less applicable to automation and maybe more applicable to intuition. Those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. So benefit regret, and then when you look at the process that you're automating, you want to be concerned with the uncertainty and the unpredictability around that particular process that's being automated. And again, back to what we talked about with the perceptions, if you have something that is a potential big regret, something that's an uncertain process, that you can't really explain, and we're going to get into that as we talk about these federal initiatives, or something that there's a lot of unpredictability around, meaning there's a pretty wide tail on how it can behave. Those are the kinds of use cases you want to be very concerned with as you're looking to automate. So let me get to the slides and ask to back up to the start, please. And I appreciate. All right, excellent. Let's go to the first slide. Thank you. All right. So the national AI initiatives that I wanted to bring to your attention today are a couple from the executive branch. There's one from the from Congress, and then there's some work that's happening at some of the various agencies. So there are actually 2 executive orders on artificial intelligence for those that may not be familiar with that. One is focused on maintaining American leadership, and I think there may be perceptions that America is behind. We're actually quite ahead, but we've got some determined competitors out there. And so, promoting American competency, the development of, American strategies and technologies, and all these kinds of things that will allow us to maintain leadership in this important technology is very, very important. The former head of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, made a statement at a conference that I was at that basically we said was in 5 years, not being a leader in artificial intelligence is probably not a problem, but in 20 years, we will have an unacceptable risk of losing on the battlefield if we don't maintain our leadership. So that's the criticality around that particular executive order. And then as we were talking about with stakeholder concerns, the adoption of artificial intelligence, managing projects, promoting the use of trustworthy artificial intelligence is very, very important in that regard. What does it mean to have a trustworthy artificial intelligence system? I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There was a National Artificial Intelligence Act, which is very important because it establishes and formalizes some of the leadership around artificial intelligence within the federal government. And then lastly, I want to call everyone's attention to something that was led by a congressional effort. This is in the legislative branch. The National Security Commission for Artificial Intelligence was established, I think it was 2018, and they completed their 2-year effort. And they're going to continue work beyond, but their 2-year effort was to produce a report on the national security implications of artificial intelligence. And their report is very informative, very broad based. It was chaired by Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. So next slide, please. All right, so I think I talked a little about the AI executive orders, but let's get down into them a little bit more. So there's 5 key lines of effort associated with maintaining American leadership, and I'll do a little aside here. Generally, whenever we're talking about this kind of thing, there's always a set of concerns that are laid out. Obviously, how much money is being spent, that's important. Today I believe we're actually being outspent by some other countries. We want to make sure that federal computing and data resources are available to the best of our ability to folks that are creating AI technologies. And so there's a lot of challenges to sharing data and all of that. So, I want to be very clear. We're not just opening up and giving all federal data out, but there's certainly an interest in sharing the data that can be shared to train systems. AI technical standards, what's involved with that? What can the federal government do? What should the federal government not do? We always have this one. This is very important, even with cybersecurity is my main thing. But how do we build up a strong workforce with qualified people? I think sessions like this are very important to opening the door for that and getting folks to see what they might have to learn and how they could go about learning that. And then lastly, how we build alliances. The National AI Initiative Act, which we'll come to in a second, actually established a office which will promote these activities. So the second executive order, which is the use of trustworthy artificial intelligence, actually got down into what does it mean to be trustworthy. And there was some work at NIST to actually produce a document around what does trustworthy artificial intelligence mean. So we'll talk about that. Next slide, please. Most recently formed to oversee the first executive order that we talked about, the National AI Initiative in Office. It's being headed up by Lynn Parker, who was previously she was the AI lead out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is in those two big buildings that are just to the west of the White House. It will be the central hub for federal AI research and policy making. And this is a big deal because, when the government engages, we can have a big impact, and they want to make sure that we're having an impact that is directed and focused on the objectives that we have. Next slide, please. I mentioned the National Security Commission for Artificial Intelligence final report. This is a very, very long report. I think I spent about 3 days reading it, 2 of them over a weekend. It's really, really, really good. I cannot underscore how well written this report was. The research was extensive. Again, it is a recommendation from a commission to Congress. It is not a law. It is not the policy of the administration. But this independent commission, which was staffed by a number of luminaries and chaired by Eric Schmidt, covered 2 main areas. One is, how do we defend America? As this is a national security report, right? How do we defend America? And what does that mean when AI becomes prevalent? And easily moves into, how do we win the technology competition? Because as I mentioned before, certainly, folks feel very strongly that it is important to maintain the American advantage in this technology area. And as you can see, within the little graphic that's here, there's within each of these sections, there's 8 chapters. In particular, for us, emerging threats in the AI era, there's this natural connection between artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. I mentioned, those 3 dimensions that we look at technology, whether how we're going to use it, how our stakeholders are going to use it, or how how our adversaries are going to use it. And certainly AI is one of those technologies that has broad uses in all those categories. And then lastly, chapter 16 talks about associated technologies. And again, I will go back to something that I said early on. The focus is to, just, well, this is AI, and we're just, but a lot of these other technologies that are related that come along with your AI project, you really aren't getting the kind of attention that they need. And I think that's, something that's very important for folks to be aware of. Hopefully I'm doing okay on the chat here. I'm not sure if there's been any questions along the way. Looks good. All right. So let's go to the next slide, please.
I'm managing that. There was a quick question.
Oh, is there a quick question?
Yeah, Martin, just a quick question, if you can hear me, is the final report
I didn't hear the whole question, so I'm gonna ask. Is the report available to the public? Absolutely. Just Google NSCAI final report, and it's you can get yourself a 700-page PDF.
Thanks, Martin.
They've done some really cool things on their website to make it easier to get through all the material. And obviously, you can search for keywords and things like that. All right, let's move on to some of the federal efforts, from some of the agencies. We work very closely with NIST. There's the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, FISMA, is how we do cybersecurity across the federal government. There's 3 big players within the FISMA Act. There's DHS or CISA, which is got the FISMA delegation within the act. There's OMB, which is Office of Management and Budget, which directs and oversees agencies, and then there's NIST, which creates standards. So these 3 groups work very closely together, and we have a great partnership with NIST, and they've done a lot of the work related to the executive orders, in a broad public, kind of way. So I mentioned one of the things that was a priority in. Yeah. Okay. Great. I see the report in the link. That's in the link in the chat. That's excellent. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things that the executive orders were striving for was to identify how should the federal government engage in standards associated with artificial intelligence. And NIST, working in a public, fashion, as they do a really excellent job of doing, involving hundreds and hundreds of stakeholders and probably thousands and thousands of comments, created a plan for federal engagement in the development of technical standards and related tools in support of reliable, robust, and trustworthy systems that use AI technologies. Again, that's all these things that I'm putting up here are actually available and should be, you can easily find them with a Google search. The ones that are draft, I'm highlighting as draft, meaning they're not finalized yet. And it's important to understand that if something says draft, it means it could change, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. This plan actually talks about how the federal government can be involved and where we should and where we shouldn't be involved in the development of standards around these areas. They also created a NISTer, which is, it's a document that is a reference implementation of one of their standards. And so, okay, I'm looking at the chat here. This one I found to be fantastic, the 4 principles of explainable artificial intelligence. It's still, I believe, in a draft form, but it makes it very clear, and we'll talk about it, what explainability really means. They also developed a taxonomy and terminology of adversarial machine learning. I don't know if any of the previous speakers talked about this, but we've got a real problem in dealing with AI with the terminology around it. A lot of times people talk about algorithms, and they talk about all kinds of different technologies, and they use all different kinds of terms. And it makes it hard, particularly when you're looking at terminologies to make sure that you're speaking precisely and you're speaking about the same thing. I talked about the NSC-AI report. There's also a NITRD AI R&D strategy. So NITRD is actually an IT research and development consortium across federal agencies. There's a number of participating agencies. They establish and report on the priorities. These again are all publicly available. We'll talk about that. Specific to DHS, in response to the executive orders, we created an AI strategy, which is publicly available. I'm doing a time check here. I think I've got like, what, 5 more minutes, it looks like, Raj?
Yeah, you're looking good.
All right, perfect. So we'll hammer through these. And then there's an AI for cybersecurity and cybersecurity for AI workshop where the materials are available for folks to take a look at. Next slide, please. So the 4 principles of explainable AI. This is, providing explanations that are meaningful, that are, accurate, and also reflect the knowledge limits of this system. Really, really good, goes into great depth on these topics to explain to folks what those mean and why it's important. Next slide, please. I talked about the R&D, the national R&D plan. This is for the participating agencies. As you can see, the 8 strategic focus areas. There's a lot of money that's being invested in AI R&D through this process, and all this stuff is available for folks to take a look at. And to the extent that the products are releasable, they're being made available to folks to use as well. As you can see, expanding public-private partnerships and building up the national AI R&D workforce are big and important focus areas here. And I think the next slide is maybe the last slide. I got 2 more slides. All right, really quick. So and the last 2 slides here, we talk about the Department of Homeland AI strategy, Department of Homeland Security AI strategy, and I would like to highlight a very important part in this strategy, which is that the work that we do at DHS, is very important in so many different ways, but we have a great concern for our reputation. We want to make sure that, there's clear guidelines and authorities around the use of information, the way the information is being used in our systems. It is first and foremost in our mind when we're applying technology. And I think that is something that is really important to highlight as we talk about this. There's a great deal of care and concern that goes into the use of AI, the data that we're using, and the application of AI across our mission space. And these reflect that. What are the potential impacts? How do we, do good investments? How do we manage the risks? How do we improve our workforce so that we know what we're doing? And then lastly, but not least, is obviously improving our public trust and our public engagement around the application and use of these technologies. Last slide. And then if you get a chance and you're really interested in how AI and cybersecurity have this symbiosis, there was a workshop that I participated in maybe like 2 years ago at this point, where this cross-agency R&D group conducted a workshop on the interrelationships between cybersecurity and AI, and came up with some conclusions about how do we secure AI systems, and then what are the best uses, and what are the things that we should be concerned about when using AI in cybersecurity. We found this to be very helpful as we set and establish our priorities. So Raj, with that, I think I'll probably close it out. I didn't think I would speak for 30 minutes. I'm always nervous when I do. And
thank you. Thanks, Martin.
And I appreciate the handling the slides.
Yeah. So the report, the 700 page, there was in the chat, so it's available publicly, and the link was shared. And there was one more question. I think it's for you, because it just came in a little early. It says, does Scrum and user feedback design help reduce the failure of AI project?
I think we might want to punt that one to the panel.
Yeah. All right. And then I just was taking on from a question for myself, was the 700 page report. I know you said it's more of a recommendation, but do you see that as coming in as later on down the road as mandatory or regulatory for people to follow?
So I don't know, what will ultimately happen with that. I'm not sure what the status is of, the determination that Congress is going to make, that, whether or not they're going to turn any of that stuff into law or not. But I think it's important to understand what they're being told by the experts that they brought in to advise them, right? And within the report itself, there's actually draft legislation, proposed, executive orders. There's all kinds of stuff in there that talk about how you would go about implementing those recommendations.
Very good. Thanks. I think we're doing good on time. I don't see any additional questions, but if there are, please continue to share in the Q&A, and there will be an opportunity during the panel as well, which is going to be hosted by Mitchell Levy. There is one more question. How long ago was the report? Will it become obsolete?
Well, the report was just released a couple of weeks ago, and I think if you look through, you'll see that I don't think that so what would obsolete the report is not technology. What would obsolete the report would be what gets accepted and what doesn't, get accepted and implemented. So, to the extent that things that are in that report don't actually happen, that would obsolete them. In my mind, but I think they're very interesting recommendations, and they go across a number of areas, and they'll be part of the discussion and the dialogue going forward around those important issues.
Sounds good. Thanks. I think We are close to getting a quick 5-minute bio. And we have after that, Ajita John going to have her presentation from the East Coast again, and then followed by the panel. So please take a bio break, refill your coffee. I know you've been sitting in the chair. And while the video is playing, it should play no more than 4 minutes. Please come back. Thank you.
The future is here. We hear that almost daily. How can the future help the humble project manager? Should project managers fear the onset of artificial intelligence? Some fear the role of the project manager may be eliminated as AI becomes more prevalent in the workplace. Should that really be the case, or can AI help in delivering projects? AI can be seen as an opportunity in creating new opportunities, allowing the project manager to transform their role to focus on more critical and crucial responsibilities. AI in the business world is something of an open door, a new avenue to take, and is less threatening than when it was first interpreted, as it refers more to robotic functions such as operations, data collection, tracking and reporting, those repetitive tasks which hold far less value, but which need to be accomplished within business. In complex projects, AI tasks save time and improve data accuracy, thus allowing PMI's better interpretation of the data. Automating workflows, predicting risks, eliminating human bias, preventing cost overruns, or digging deeper into big data for real-time insights. These are all tasks which allow the PM to spend more time on the human side of a project, the business, stakeholders and customers. AI allows the PM to provide more succinct strategic advice to the business, to be a more substantial leader providing value outcomes, rather than simply being a manager. AI can more effectively guide PMs on where to focus their efforts, thereby more accurately increasing the potential for project success. AI is not a threat to project management jobs, but a way to spend less time managing and more time doing those tasks that add true value to a business. Project managers' soft skills like communication, critical thinking, emotional intelligence, leadership and understanding the needs of stakeholders are more valuable and more marketable than ever, and very much in demand in the world of AI. Skills currently void within any robotic AI machine. Since the core of the project management profession is not easily transferable to a machine, PMs should not be fearful of AI inadvertently hijacking their jobs. PM jobs differ widely in complexity and encompass unforeseeable or taxing challenges which cannot easily be tackled by AI. This is AI's limitation. It is relegated to recognizing patterns within data and making conclusions or forecasts based on those patterns. Therefore, AI is optimal for repetitive, predictive, or computational tasks. In other words, AI is more like a tool to enhance the project management field rather than to displace it. Imagination and adaptability is far more fluid within a project manager than within AI machines. If anything, the adoption of AI in projects will encourage the PM to embrace techniques which will sharpen soft skills, making the PM even more marketable. The introduction of automation during the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries gave way to faster manufacturing processes. This was enough to frighten many tradespeople during that period, who felt their jobs would be lost to machines. The automobile modified transportation, making the use of horses rather obsolete. The introduction of email forever changed the demand for posting letters in the mail. Each one of these transitions involved some form of mechanization, which altered the demands for certain jobs. Rightfully so, AI is yet another stage in this move toward more encompassed automation within the workforce. Like in the past, each time there was a dramatic shift in mechanization, new jobs were created, and many current jobs were enhanced, making them even more in demand. But throughout this change there was always someone needed to plan, manage, monitor and control the work, and make crucial decisions on the job. The role of the project manager will continue to evolve and will undoubtedly play a pertinent and pivotal role in the world of AI, just as it has done throughout the history of automation. Let us know your thoughts on AI. Do you think it will assist or deter from project delivery? Are you using AI within your projects now? Tell us. how. We would like to hear from you. All the very best on your project management journey.
Thanks, Tisha. I think we're coming back from the break. Hope you had enough time to get a little bio break, get your coffee refill. We're right on time. Just before the next speaker comes in, wanted to thank again for the previous speakers. Ravi spoke on the healthcare industry and the AI impact, followed by Patrick from Samsung, who spoke on the workflow. And then we moved to entirely different on the artificial intelligence, on the cybersecurity and recommendations that's coming in with 700-page report. And just for the comment, can you pull that slide up again, Dinshaw? Towards the end of this conference, there's some nice giveaways. So we're going to give away a white paper combining AI and behavioral science responsibility to all. And then there's going to be a lucky draw where one person will get a book titled Project Management Skills for All Careers. And for Mitchell Levy's program on the credibility, there is an offer there. That's the second bullet is saying. And then there is in the middle of the slide, we're going to share that in the chat as well. Please take a couple of minutes to take your survey in. All right, can move on to Ajita. So just a quick introduction. Ajita, thanks for joining from the East Coast. She is the Vice President for Artificial Intelligence for Cupid in New Jersey. She's also a founding engineer for Cupid. Have very deep expertise with 30 plus patents. I think your last count was 37 patents. And I've spoken at the other conferences as well. And in today's topic, and I'm very pleased that all the speakers are speaking at 4 different areas of the industry. And her topic is going to be on the natural language processing. And what Cupid does is in the customer experience, customer success side, where you engage with the customer using this technology. So Ajita, is all yours.
Thank you, Raj, for the introduction. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. So just a little bit of a warning. If you find that my audio, is not coming through correctly, just let me know. I can just, stop sharing my video and then it'll work. But for now, I'm going to keep it on. So
it's fantastic. It's audio and videos are pretty good.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, first of all, I'd like to thank all 3 of my previous speakers because they laid the background so beautifully for me. So I'm deeply appreciative. It makes my job a lot easier. My talk really centers on, how to build and deploy natural language processing projects. And, I may flash, 1 or 2 sort of complex looking slides, but, the purpose of those slides is not to kind of understand everything because we don't have the time today, but it's for you to sort of take away that some stages are more complex and might require, more planning on people's side. So, so with that, let me start. And what I want to start with is really talk about a blog that went viral in 2020, and it was about productivity. So, and if you read it, it went something like this. In order to get something done, maybe we need to think less. Sometimes counterintuitive, but I believe sometimes our thoughts can get in the way of the creative process. We can work better at times when we tune out the external world. And you can see it goes on, and it's like several paragraphs. And this blog went viral last year. People commented on it. They loved it. Now, you might say, well, was it written by, Liam Poor, who was a student at UC Berkeley? Actually, it wasn't. It was auto-generated by OpenAI's GPT-3 language model, right? And all Liam did was to give the prompt, feeling unproductive, maybe you should stop overthinking, right? That is the title of the blog. And the model pretty much generated the entire article. It's so much so that it fooled, almost everybody into thinking that a real person wrote it, right? So this is an example of a language model that can generate, text that is seemingly coherent. Now, we might take it for granted, but just a few years ago, we were not even close. So the point that I'm sort of trying to make is that NLP has really taken vast strides, in the last few years. And we'll sort of touch upon, some of these strides, what is useful for us today, what can we use easily, and what is sort of harder to use, right? So now that I talk about models, I know that the previous speakers did speak a lot about models, so I'm going to benefit off that. But I'll get into a little bit of what models mean in NLP, and you might have a task like for your company that says, well, go get the social media posts that your customers are putting on Twitter and predict the sentiment of a tweet, right? And that tweet may be, your product brought sunshine to my day. Right? Or you might have something like, your product pretty much did everything it was not supposed to do. Now, you might think it's fairly trivial to predict the sentiment of a piece of text. You can just look at some keywords and then say whether it's positive or negative. But the reality is that it gets harder because people can express positivity or negativity in so many different ways. And so it cannot be a simple task of just checking for certain words. And in reality, it is a very difficult task, right? And so, you need a model that can sort of predict. And AI models are simply about learning like a very complex math function to predict the output, right? And in this case, you want to say, yes, it's positive or negative, right? And in order to predict that output, you have to teach the model. And Patrick referred to this. It's like a student, he goes to school, and I'll take the example of a little kid who goes to school, and the teacher in the classroom starts to enforce certain positive behaviors, which say, a green sticker means good behavior, a red sticker means, maybe we could deviate from that, right? And the child pretty much starts to understand, what is good behavior and what is not appropriate behavior. And this is pretty much the same thing. So we need kind of some text, and that text could be, input with some sentences like, okay, I like the product is a positive one. Don't buy this product is a negative one. And you can have hundreds or thousands of these sort of pieces of text. And that text is sort of fed into the model, and the model trains. And the beauty of it in NLP is that you can take text, which are words, and then it learns sort of a mathematical function, right? To predict whether, your first statement about your product bringing sunshine to my day can be predicted as positive or 1, or the second one can be predicted to be negative or 0, right? So if you step back, basically sort of the key things of the whole process are, you should be asking for any NLP task, what is my task, right? In this case, the task happens to be predicting sentiment. And we look at some other tasks too, right? But once you identify your task, then you got to figure out, what is my data set that I will train my model or teach my model to recognize, right? And that data set is typically in NLP, just, mostly text. And then the third aspect of it is that in order to learn that complex math function that you see out there, you need some kind of framework to sort of, so that that model can be built, right? Those are the sort of 3 things that we today will try to focus and hone in, and hopefully I'll sort of go into what, some of these things mean. Okay? So So, you know, let's look at the framework first. And this is one of those sort of, I know, complex slides, but, you know, I would like to sort of flash some, you know, understanding of what these complex frameworks are, right? Now, this is, of course, in the context of neural networks, a very simple framework. So what this neural network does is to actually learn a function for predicting whether something is positive or negative. And on the left-hand side are the inputs or the words, you know, these sentences that you had, and you're going to feed it into the neural network. And at each layer, you have these little, you know, neurons that are trying to decide what they need to output. Okay, and their outputs are basically fed on to the next layer and so on until at the final layer on the rightmost side, you know, you can classify whether one sentence is positive or one sentence is negative, right? That is the key process that happens here. Now, what is important to understand is that, you know, very often, even after you've learned a particular model, or learned a particular function, I mean, it's not perfect. You know, you take your model, you know, and this is something that as project managers you will face. You know, it's not like asking a software developer, okay, go get the data from the database and then show it on the website, right? And they might take maybe 2 or 3 days to do that task, and they come back and tell you it's done. And then it goes to QA tests it, might go back and forth for, you know, 2 or 3 times, and then it's done. Right? You can put it out there and it's going to be there working for a very long time. Unfortunately, this process is not that easy because learning this function is, and I think Patrick mentioned this, you know, in his talk, is that, you know, learning this function is not, you know, it's not the accuracy rarely reaches sort of 100%, which is that you might learn you know, how to classify into positive and negative with maybe 80%, 85%. If you get 90%, that's actually a pretty good model, right? Which means that, you know, it failed even on 10% of your test set. And so when you deploy it out into the real world, it might actually fail even, you know, at a higher rate. But that is something that is part of the process. So when it fails, let's say you deploy it and you find that it's missing out on 50% of your queries, you know, then you got to go back and you'll have machine learning engineers who will work to tweak the model, add more data to train, and that might take a few months, right? As Patrick had mentioned. And so this process, understanding that this process is difficult and it takes more time, you know, will mean that, you know, you will provision more time for training and fine tuning and setting up expectations that, you know, the first or the second or the third deployment of the model is probably, you know, not going to be great, but it'll eventually reach a level that is probably good, right? So while, you know, while I showed the previous neural network and I said, well, that was a simple model, this is actually, you know, a snapshot of some of the, you know, current models that we see today. These are called transformers, and these are the linchpins of, you know, like that GPT-3 that was able to generate a whole article. Right? They're very, very complex, but the beauty of it is that most machine learning engineers don't have to code this up anymore. There are frameworks that they can use to set up, and, you know, and we'll show some of it here. And that is sort of the beauty of it, is that while a software engineer might have to write about 200 to 300 lines of code to achieve something small, the machine learning engineer probably writes very few lines of code to achieve something really, really big, because some of these frameworks give you so much for free. However, there is a lot of time in the data prep and then in the training and the fine tuning. So I'm going to use sort of this, you know, fictitious application to sort of motivate the rest of the talk. And my application is called a Wisal application, and let's say it's deployed, you know, Okay, and it's deployed, in a university, and you have students who come in and ask the wise owl questions, right? So students might ask things like, well, what time does the machine learning class meet, right? And that's an example of a question and answer task. So, people might ask a question, and your AI application, NLP application, has to be able to answer that. And they're able to answer that based on some knowledge that you've trained your AI model with, right? A second thing, a type of AI task could be something like this. A student might say, I need to schedule an appointment with Dr. Boyd. So it might be, scheduling an appointment with the health center. So that's an example of classification. You're trying to figure out, the intent of the user. What do they want, right? Maybe they want to schedule an appointment with the doctor. Maybe they want to check out for a book from the library. Maybe they need to register a course for a course. So you have to figure out the intent of the user. And very often these intents would also mean that you need to figure out, are there any names in the query? Are there any locations, organizations, both, and that's called entity detection. And entity detection is important not only from the perspective of understanding the intent, you also may want to redact that, for privacy purposes. Now, another one example of a task is a student might say, I'm anxious about my grades, right? And you may need to detect sentiment or emotion because you may want to, connect them up with the counselor, right? And this can be, for a company, you might want to detect, positive and negative tweets, like in the example that we saw earlier. You might have, students querying in other languages other than English. So you might have to deal with multilingual domains, right? A student might come and say, oh, well, I missed a class yesterday, so I want a summary of yesterday's, World History 101, right? So you want to give them a summarization based on something that the notes that the professor has put across. So these are some examples of commonly used tasks today. There are others, but these are some things that could come up, say, in some of the projects, AI projects in NLP that you might, be working on, or could be working on in the future. So the question that if you were to take on some of these tasks in your projects, what would it involve, right? What would you have to do to deploy these models, right? So some of the things like sentiment or entity recognition, your needs may not or are not likely to be different from the rest of the world. So your requirements are kind of standard. So you don't need to build or train models because there are already pre-built models that you could use that could work for you fairly well, right? And so that's the key sort of, one takeaway that I want you to have is that if you want to, for instance, gather all the tweets about your company and then, put it through a sentiment detection or entity recognizer, and then generate reports for, how many positive tweets did I get? How many negative tweets did I get? Or what were the entities, what names were mentioned, or, what organizations were mentioned? Those you can do. You just need a software developer, who can use these packages and then just integrate with the packages and with reports, and it can be easily done without training, right? Unless you have special entities, right? If you have specific entities for your own organizations, that might require a little more, training, right? Now, what about these other tasks? Things like question and answer, right? Those are a different domain because your knowledge, your company's knowledge or this university's knowledge is specific to them. It's different. So it's like saying, I know there are models out there that can do this for me, but their knowledge is not the same as mine. So whenever there's a knowledge gap, you cannot use or straight away use the models that are out there, and you need to do some training. And some of the tasks that need sort of these, training on your side are question and answer, summarization, or classification. Classification is one of the most common tasks that people use it for, right? You might have a little chat on your website that people can come and chat with the bot, and that, that bot could maybe recognize that, you're trying to place an order for product, or you need to get connected with an agent, or you need to pay your bill. All of those are classification. And, that is a very common sort of NLP task. And all you need to do is, give it some data with the sentences and the labels, and you can train it, and pretty, it can work, right? So since it is specific, you have to have a data set, right? And we'll come to how these data sets could be generated. And you need to have models that you can train on. So the question you might ask is, where do we start from, right? If I have to build a model and train it, where do I start from, right? It's not a package that I can just download and then just integrate, right? So, in order to decide what model you want to use, I want to show you like the spectrum of things that are there. There are things that are like, really refined and work very well, like that first, paragraph or blog that we saw, right? Those are like really, really complex models. You could start with those. Or if your needs are smaller, you can start with, fairly simple things, right? So, this is an example of a deep learning pre-trained model, right? This is called T5, and there's several models, by the way. This is a new one. It's T5 from Google, and it's a multitask model. It can do translations, it can do summarization, it can do, sentiment, all of this, it can do all of it in one, right? And it's already pre-trained. So, that's a big win. Now, you might ask, what is it trained on? Most of these models are trained on very large corpus of text like the Wikipedia. So they sort of understand language, right? So they understand that each word has sort of a contextualized embedding or meaning based on the data that they learn from, right? So the model understands that dog and puppy are related, right? And they can understand that, star in the sky is very different from the star performer in a play. Those are the sort of disambiguations that these models are very, very good at, understand. So if you want a very high quality, complex NLP model, you can certainly use one of these models, and then you can train on the pre-trained model, right? So because you have some very specific tasks like, pay my bill or order a product, right? So you could actually train on the pre-trained model, and you will need much less training in general, right? And you will need less data because the model already understands a lot of aspects of the English language, right? But there is a caveat, right? If your domain doesn't exactly match with your pre-trained data set, you will get some noise, right? And that's the sort of this fuzzy area that you get into where, you don't know what you're getting into, and you might have to try, experiment, and then you might figure out that one particular model with one particular data set is what you need, right? Now, I do want to show you, I did say things like, oh, the model understands that dog and puppy are related, or star in the sky and star performer, they're different. How does it understand the meaning of words, right? And this is sort of an aside, but I think it's a fun thing for you to kind of understand, how the model sort of understands this, right? Essentially, in the model, words are represented by a series of numbers, okay? And in this case, it's a series of 50 numbers. And each word, may have a similarity to another word based on how close those numbers are. So if you look here closely, you will see that, boy and man are very similar in some of those numbers, but then it's actually different in others. So that the similarities capture how boy and man are used in text, right? And the differences, capture the differences of, how they are used in text. And so it exactly captures the similarities and differences that they are trained on, from the text. Okay, so if you do go with one of these sort of complex models, which are, sort of these newer models, they come at a cost, right? So you may need less training. However, they have a lot of parameters. So there's a lot of computation going on in here. So typically they run, even for your small, your few training cycles that you would use for, they will require GPUs. So you have to sort of, these are special processing, processing units. So they would not run well on regular CPUs. So that is a cost that you have to take, right? And so you have to be aware that, they do require more CPU and more memory than any of your regular models, right? So so let's step back and see, okay, so if I didn't go that big route, I don't want to do this high quality model and I don't have that much memory or CPU, what are, sort of my options, right? So if you were doing a classification, right, you could, you might be doing things, scheduling an appointment, check out a book, etc. You can use very simple models that are not even deep learning. Right? You can use, if your data set is small, you can use naive Bayes or logistic regression. So always start for your problem, try to start with a simple model as a baseline. This is what I really urge. Don't, go out and, take the big model and try to start working with that. Take a simple model and see what you need. How does your data set work with that model? And then decide whether, you need a bigger framework to address your problems, right? So if your classification problem is really, really big, you might have to use deep learning. And again, you don't need to straight away go with these complex models like T5 or BERT. You can hire, machine learning engineers, and then, they can set up a framework for you using TensorFlow, PyTorch, and that will work fairly well for many, many purposes. It'll work, right? But if you want to go for things like Q&A, they do benefit from deep learning models. If you want to do language detect, there are many pre-trained models and you don't need to do any training at all, right? If you want to do a named entity recognition, again, there are pre-trained models. If you want to detect things like date, name, email, identifiers, you can build simple regex functions and they will take care of all of that, right? The question that you might ask is, how much training data do I need, right? And that really depends on your task, right? Is it possible to train with less data? Yes. I've done a lot of models where I've had very little data and I still got it working, for a particular customer. But in general, the more, the better, right? The source of the data can be forums, websites, chats, etc. You can also, for chat bots, you can curate data. And they can work very, very well for small domains. You can create a set of training phrases that are sort of tightly bound to what the user could be asking. Okay? But the most important point that I'll make here is make sure you test your data for offensive language, images, and bias. Because remember, these models are just stochastic parrots. They basically repeat back what you teach them. Right? So if you have a question answering system, make sure that the data that you're training them on is screened for, all of these aspects. Right? If you need multilingual, capabilities, many of these new models do have multilingual versions, but they don't always work, very well for all the tasks because it's still an active area of research. But however, you can get models up and running for any language by using a simple neural network model. You don't use pre-trained model. You can use, sort of a TensorFlow and a simple neural network. It can recognize phrases, etc., in any language, and that will work very well for simple domains. Now, another question that comes up is that, okay, I train my model, I leave it out there. How long do I have to change it? Well, you may not need to change it. If your, needs and domain don't change that much, you can leave it there for many months. However, your knowledge may be dynamic. Let's say you have to present like a timeline of news items, like to the students or to your customers. You want to show them the most popular products or advertisements. Then your knowledge is dynamic. In that case, it's not enough to train once every few months. You may have to train every couple of days or every day, right? So that's called online learning. So the already deployed model gets new data as a batch, and then it can train quickly and learn new things that way. Some of the best practices that I want to sort of and this is almost my last slide. Start with a simple model. Make sure that the queries to the model are logged. What's your accuracy rate? What are your failure rates? Try to use a feedback mechanism from the users that can tell you whether you are going in the right direction or not, right? And control the user experience, right? If your AI model makes inaccurate predictions, always ask your user, did I get that wrong? Try to have that control there so that they don't get frustrated, right? And what I'd like to end with is, showing you a piece of Shakespeare poetry that was generated by the, GPT-3 model. It looks eerily like Shakespeare, but that shows you the, the power of these models. Okay, that's all I have. Any questions?
Thank you, Ajita, for wrapping up with the poetry. And I believe one of the movies had dialogues generated by the AI models as well. We are right about the time for the next session, but there was one question for you, Ajita, was how can we get the link to the pre-trained model?
If you do a search for BERT or T5, Google, you are going to run across all these models and links for them, blogs discussing, etc. There are light versions of BERT that that don't require a lot of CPU and memory, so those can be run very easily. So look, just search for light BERT and things like that. There are a lot of references.
Thanks, Ajita, and it was a fantastic presentation. We are right at the time for a panel discussion. This will be hosted by Mitchell Levy. He is very well known to the audience here, but those who don't, we'll go over a little intro. He's an author, he's an entrepreneur, he's a TEDx speaker, and really a global credibility expert. He's interviewed over 500 thought leaders, which led him to uncover some of these amazing insights, which he will probably share today. And he's also the international best author for over 60 books, and some of his businesses have one of the published over 750 books. And I did mention in the breakout, there is an offer among the goodies. So Mitchell, why don't you speak a little bit more on at the beginning what the offer is, and then all the speakers, they're all yours. And audience, if you have any questions, continue to type into the Q&A tab, and I'll bring that up for Mitchell for the speakers. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Actually, if I could share screen just for like less than 30 seconds, that would be great. What I'd like you to think about, I just want to say thank you to everybody. I've loved the content so far. Adakunle, have to say you came the farthest from Nigeria. Nancy Marino, you asked the most amount of questions. So thanks for your participation. I'd like to ask a couple more that you just put into the chat. And then I'll tell you quickly about the offer. On the chat, if you could put in that one thing that you learned, like if you were going to go to the next conversation you had and said, oh my God, I went to this great event and this is the one thing I learned, put that into the chat. I'd love to see that. I've got the first question queued up and the rest will come based on what I hear from what you guys say. So because of the work that I did is I ended up interviewing 500 thought leaders. And what I found is most people, what they really want in life is they want to feel bound to somebody else. They want to feel like that people know, love, and trust them, that people appreciate them for who they are and what they do. And in a lot of cases, that bond comes from a family member or a really horrific work environment or some common goal or something that's a negative thing that people have to go through. And what I have to say is we are releasing Credibility Nation. and it's an opportunity for you to get to know, like, and trust other people. And so the membership, what you get, you see the things up here, plus probably the most important stuff is this private community. It's $10 a month. For this audience, you get the first 2 weeks free. So if you don't like what you see, you could just come in, take a look at and take the courses and then take off. And if that is the right thing to do, that's okay with me. So scan the barcode or just go to this URL. I'll put in the chat later, aha.pub/credibility, and it'll bring you to our community. And that's enough for that. And thank you.
Thank you, Mitchell.
Oh, you're welcome. So I'm going to look at the chat. I'd love for you guys to put in the chat, what's that one thing you learned from this opportunity, from this day? And I've got one other question. And so after you do that, and I'll read that, what is the one question you didn't ask yet? So just put that in the chat. I'll read through that as we're answering. And what I'd like to ask our panelist is, what was interesting to me when I watched the movie that was on during the break, I think that was the most burning question I had, which is, what does that mean for if I'm a PM today, does my job go away? What if AI does really well and I get put out of a job? And so yeah, the movie was cool. What I'd like to say is, for those PMs inside your company, or those people you want to hire, what is that one skill that you either see in people come in and it's amazing, or something that if somebody's watching or listening, what should they pay attention to? What should they do going forward? And, Ajita, since you were last, you must be primed up and ready to go. Why don't we start with you? And then if you want everyone, we could just, if you could figure out how to go alphabetically, you can do that.
Okay, so would you like me to answer?
Oh, yes, please. So what is that one thing you'd like to see your PMs, that people who you want to work with inside the companies, what's that skill set they either bring in that's amazing, or something they need to learn and grow with?
I think it is managing uncertainty. So that is the part that I think is the hardest. Sort of anticipating what could go wrong, right? Is that uncertainty, especially in AI, and then working that into the process in terms of time management, in terms of task management, and then communicating expectations, right? And I think that art is is the hardest, and I think it's a very hard job, on project managers in this field.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's by the way true for anything in life. Martin, how would you answer that one?
Sure. So, I think that is, really at the heart of this is, what should project managers take away from this? And I think it's a couple things, and it's a hard job, right? Project managers deal with trouble, in all the projects that I've been involved in, that I've observed that, the project managers were always dealing with problems. And so I think the point that Ajita made is very important around, anticipating and understanding what could be, lurking around the corner. But also, I would say making yourselves, aware of what are the main failure areas, and what are the main resource, areas that are going to be involved in AI projects, and how are you going to communicate about them? Because there's a lot of concern, there's a lot of fear, comment about people losing their jobs and things like that. I think those are the kinds of conversations you have to meet head on, and you have to talk about, well, no, we're actually automating the stuff that is good to be automated, because humans really aren't good at it, and we're freeing up tasks for things that humans are good at, which is like learning from no examples or very, very few examples. And where intuition is important and sensing is important, and those are the kinds of things that we're gonna free up to allow humans to do.
I like that. It's interesting. I agree with you. But although what's interesting to me, what's interesting is people don't always believe that. I know the words are being said, but they don't always believe it. Patrick, I'm interested to hear what you have to say based on some of the stats and ideas of why projects fail. What do you think, Patrick? What do PMs need to be thinking about?
So I totally agree with Ajita and Martin on what they've said. And in addition to that, I would encourage project managers to quote unquote get their hands dirty. So get to know the domain from which the data set comes. So if it's medical, put on an overall and go to a hospital for 3 days, and put yourself into those people's shoes. I did a lot of work in the oil and gas industry, and I benefited tremendously from driving out into the desert with the maintenance crew, taking a screwdriver into my hands and doing whatever needed to be done to figure out what is the problem these people are talking about, right? And then I can go manage that project because I understand what I'm supposed to solve. If I only sit in the office building, I'll never get it. And so I encourage people to stop data science for a moment and learn from the real users what the task is. In addition, of course, to what's been said about the actual management.
By the way, I think, Patrick, you win for me. The 80% of projects fail because of that poor communication, and the 10% because it's not even set up properly to start. I love those numbers. And Robbie, you're going to win the best slide, because every time your picture was up, I kept looking over going, man, he's really intently watching, and and then it's your picture. How would you answer that question on what PMs need to focus on?
Right, definitely. I'd like to kind of touch on all the point Ajita, Patrick, and Martin kind of mentioned about handling an AI project. Risk management is a big thing, and Patrick kind of mentioned that you kind of realize towards the end of the project that things are going south, and that has happened quite often. Because there could be a lot of confounding factors there, and going over having the domain knowledge is really critical, because is actually it's really interesting how Patrick mentioned about going to the oil fields, doing their thing, because that gives you a perspective about what you're doing and what kind of impact that's kind of making overall. And having the knowledge ground up is really critical in that aspect as well. And going back to the video that was played during the break, I know that, there is a certain legitimate fear that AI is going to take over a lot of project managers' job. But what I really think about is it might take some portion of the stuff you do on a regular basis, but mostly AI could help you do repetitive tasks. That's what I see that's coming in the future. But other than that, I guess there needs to be some human controlling over some other human. So that's my approach, I guess.
And Raj, because I could see you, I know you're not officially on this panel, but you're a pretty distinguished guy. Would you like to? You're more than welcome to answer this question or pass. I'll leave that up to you, Raj. Head nod or head shake, or I guess if the mute button doesn't come off, you're not going to answer. Okay. All right. So the next thing comes to mind, then I'll take one of the questions from the audience, is simply, when you look at the bios and you listen to all of you speak, the what we learned, what was powerful, if you just read the chat, what people took away was really important, really very valuable. The question I ask would be, of one of your peers, and we'll go backwards, Robbie, so you could start, of your peers, what thing did you take away from one of the other speakers? Like, what did you go, oh my God, that's so cool, I'm glad they brought this up? So you want to start, Robbie?
Sure. All right, sure. As actually, there were a lot of points. I don't have much of a technical background in terms of where I come from. I have primarily mostly worked in the healthcare So it was actually knowing about the NLP stuff was really cool that Ajita mentioned about how the modeling kind of works, and then Patrick's stats about how things can go wrong and things like that, and Martin's stuff about the cybersecurity aspect and the AI was really interesting and good to learn. So I wouldn't say I would pick one, but all the presenter were equally interesting to me since I don't have that technical niche.
And Patrick, thanks, Ravi. What stood out to you?
So, I mean, first of all, I'm always glad to talk to my peers to figure out I'm not the only one in trouble, right? That's emotionally very helpful. But I really appreciated Martin's presentation about the view of the government on this, with the various governmental entities that are into this. You know, our gut reaction is more we do things in spite of the government rather than because of or for the government. And so it's good to keep an open channel of communication between private industry and government, because we're mutually relevant to each other in this field.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see where that came from. And I looked at the PDF that was shared that you mentioned, Martin, but the PDF shared was only 30 pages and you said something like 700 pages. So if maybe I got the wrong URL. So if at some point in time, if you could share that, that would be great.
Sure. If there's, it sounds like there's interest. I'll get the whole list of the links to Raj and we can send them out.
Beautiful. And how about you? What did you take away from today from your peers?
Well, so, you know, I think we've all, you know, had some interesting, you know, experiences with project management, and, you know, in particular, you know, these projects where, you know, you've got issues arise that were never even risks that were being considered, and all of a sudden you have them. And so I thought Ajita's comments about, you know, that were you know, really important, because as a project manager, for the project to be successful, you've got to be looking around the corner. And then also, you know, I definitely, you know, as a troubleshooter, really appreciated the things that Patrick was talking about, and really all the presenters are you know, this is maybe one of the best you know, technical presentations I've seen from a group of folks, and you know, it's really to the benefit of the attendees, I think.
Nice. Yeah, and I should have said up front, for the organizers that are behind the scenes, I want to say thank you. This was very well done, very well orchestrated. The quality of the content, I'm so happy to have been asked and to be able to be here. Ajita, what do you think?
Well, you know, yeah, thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Michelle, for you know, moderating this panel. And I learned something from every talk today. So, you know, right from Ravi's, you know, AI in healthcare, which, I mean, I don't work in healthcare, so it was really illuminating to see how, all the different things. Patrick is, you know, clearly from, you know, I'm very familiar with the workflow in AI, but he sort of brought forth a lot of the, you know, the numbers are very interesting, right? You know, and where you fail, that certainly matches up with my anecdotal experience. And, you know, Martin's talk it was really good to see how the government is really putting, you know, its effort and resources behind this new, you know, sort of emerging area. And we really need to have, you know, the government putting resources and effort into it, and that's great. So all talks were great.
Yeah, they really were. And I want to say, from a credibility perspective, what you just heard was spreading cred dust. It's that magic that happens when you share somebody else's ideas, thoughts, or actions. And I want to just continue to spread a little bit to Nancy Marino, because, you know, I'm looking at all the questions. I'm trying to figure out which one to do next. And the one that always gets me are KPIs. So how do I learn? How do I continue to grow as a project manager? on particularly Ravi, you're going to be lined up first because the question was specifically to you. What methodologies Ravi used to track progress and measure metrics? But I would assume everyone has their own approach that they'd like to share. And I'm also going to do a shout out to if you're not a member of the project management world, this is a great, if you saw the quality of this is the type of stuff they do, you should join and be a member of project management world. Ravi, how do you track progress and measure metrics?
So basically, on a day-to-day basis, we follow the waterfall methodology to track how things are going, because each of my processes is kind of dependent upon one or the other preliminary factors, and some of the measure metrics would be like the amount of data, amount of lesion, amount of mass we kind of get based on the sites and things like that, things of that nature.
And is there a particular tool set? Do you guys want to mention tool sets or approaches in addition to the framework, but a particular tool sets that you work with?
Mostly Zira and project, Microsoft Project. And there's this new tool called Monday.com where you kind of keep track of things, where they stand and all that. But there are a lot of tools out there, but those are the three primary ones we kind of use on a regular day-to-day basis.
Gotcha. And Patrick, how about you?
Yeah, so first I want to say that, KPIs and metrics are very curious things. And many project managers like to evolve their metrics with the evolving project, which is then always a great thing, because you always succeed. So one of the things I would encourage people to do is to come up with your metrics at the very beginning and stick with them, and because then only then is it a genuine metric. It very much depends on the project. Sometimes the metric is measured in dollars. Sometimes it's measured in model accuracy. Sometimes it's measured in the number of data points required before a certain quality of model is achieved. It really depends on what you're doing. But ultimately, of course, with a commercial company like Samsung, the bottom line is a dollar number. That is the ultimate metric.
And by the way, as a PM, no matter who you are, where you are, even healthcare, you need to be thinking about that. How about government, Martin?
Hey, so I think a lot's been said on KPIs with respect to projects. But one of the things that I'll say about metrics, which we didn't have an opportunity to talk about before, which is something that I heard from a very well renowned and highly regarded AI expert, is that we really shouldn't be looking to build AI systems unless we've got a human performance metric that we can put against it. So we don't really know how well we're doing unless we really have something that we can measure how good humans do, whether it's classifying or its accuracy or whatever it happens to be, because we don't know how good the system is actually doing. So I would encourage project managers, as they're working on they're working with their teams, to ask them, well, is there a human performance metric around that? Like, does human gets 98%, what's going to be our plan for this system if it's 95%? Because I think what we do know, especially if we think about autonomous vehicles, not something that's my specialty, but if we think about something like autonomous vehicles, obviously with the benefit regret that could be associated with that, is the autonomous vehicles are going to have to do better than humans. I don't know what that number is, but they're going to have to, because if they don't, it won't be tolerable. So we really do need to understand those things.
Thanks, Martin. And Ajita?
Yeah, so my experience has been, certainly at the end of the day, it's money, right? Are more customers signing up? Are customers leaving? That is sort of the final metric. But internally, I think I did say it in one of my slides. It's the question of making sure that you have some feedback mechanism to understand if your models are working for the user population that you've deployed it for, right? If you can have some direct feedback mechanism, such as, maybe ratings or thumbs up, thumbs down, or depending on what you're doing. So if you're looking at, say, Netflix does not need a direct feedback mechanism by just the fact that if you watch the videos that they are recommending to you, right, they know that their recommendation engine is good, right? And so it's sort of evaluating the actual problem and saying, can I have, or can I instrument, or is there a feedback mechanism already available to me? And and then measuring that and keeping track of that is sort of really essential, right? But there is sort of a nefarious loop there, in a sense of, if you are, for instance, recommending things to people, and they are picking those, they don't get the option of picking things that you didn't recommend, right? And and you got to watch out for that too. And so be very, 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 careful about, what it is that users are being provided and what it is that the feedback that they're giving back to you.
And that actually leads to the next question. And it's really hard when you're going in a panel of 4 people to say something that other people didn't say, and you did. So congratulations. And I didn't actually spend time with a panelist ahead of time, and I would have said one thing, and they're actually delivering. And that is answering TV style answers versus radio. And you guys are doing spectacular. So thank you, because we've been able to go through a number of questions. So this will be the last question, and it's kind of the wrap up as well. And I'm going to base it a little bit based on what Roger asked in the Q&A. And that is, as we move forward, what needs to happen is we need to trust the systems that we're working with. And Martin, you even almost addressed that a little bit in your last answer. We need to trust that what we're getting, is it from a human? Is it from AI? Is it from a bot? Is it from a virtual human? Like, where's this from? Do we trust it? And there's so much things, in my words, there are things out there that don't have credibility, but they're still somehow people trust them, right? So I guess the question is, moving forward, what are some of the things we can do, either both in the profession, in your vertical, or just as a PM, to drive more trust and acceptance of the things we're delivering? And this will be the last response, and we'll go alphabetically, beginning and end. So Ajita, you get to go first, and looking forward to hearing you.
Yeah, that's really a great question. Trusting the system, firstly, you have to trust the system with your data, right? When you interact with these systems, you are, inadvertently, advertently giving away your data by the queries you make, the choices you make, when you decide to watch a movie, you're giving away data all the time, right? And that data, can I trust the system with my data? So the issue of, can that data be anonymized? Who owns it, right? What will it be used in the future, right? All those questions come up, and I'm a big believer that we need to really advance in this area before we lose all sense of our privacy and opening up situations where that data can be misused. So that's my sort of 2-minute take on it.
All right, beautiful. Thank you. And guys, I'm running. I think if we get all 3 people to answer, I'm going to be running about 3 minutes late, and I hope that's okay. Martin, how would you like to answer that?
Sure, thanks. I'm actually going to be dropping off because I have to take my wife out for our anniversary. But I do think this is a very, very important topic related to this. First and foremost, project managers need to understand the trustworthiness of these systems is critical to the success of the project. Stop right, period on that point. And to understand amongst the stakeholders of the end result of these projects, what does that mean? Because trustworthiness means different things to different people. And, I've seen a lot of different kinds of, interrelationships of what are the different characteristics of trust, and when it gets broken down into, you know, its core components, you know, it's a lot of stuff. And, you know, we really get a lot out of our interaction with humans that we don't necessarily get out of machines. And so how's that going to, you know, work, and what does that mean to our stakeholders?
And
thank you, everybody.
Martin, thank you and congratulations. Patrick, how would you like to answer that?
Yeah, so first of all, I agree with what was said earlier. On top of that, there are a couple of areas that have come up recently in AI. One of them is called ethical AI, which really is if you will, a checklist for humans to check whether or not they should be engaging in this project in the first place. There are some issues that could be addressed with AI, but they simply should not be. And then there are also ways to misuse AI for purposes that were never intended in the data set or in the modeling originally, but then the model is being used for some other purpose and then does poorly. So ethical aspects are very important to make sure that the public trusts us. Secondly, there's another field within AI called explainability, which I think is critical for this, because AI models are often more accurate than the humans in the same field. So medical AI, for example, the standard doctor will diagnose a disease with about 75 to 80% accuracy rate. An AI system for the same diagnosis will do it with a 99% accuracy, yet we don't trust the AI. Why is that? Because the doctor will be able to explain his diagnosis either in fancy words or in simple words, depending on the ability of the doctor, but some explanation is better than none. And the AI system will offer no explanation at all. And that's a cause for lack of trust. And so explainable AI, in my mind, is crucial for many of the areas where the judgment is important. So medical AI, autonomous driving, use cases like this that are major billion-dollar industries right now are at the point where I'm literally putting my life into the AI's hands and have to trust, with a very high risk outcome, the AI to make its judgment properly. So I think explainability is going to go a very long way to generating trust.
That was robust. Robbie, I don't know if you're going to want to go after that one.
Sure.
Thanks,
It's actually probably Patrick kind of answered the main points here. So definitely having the trust is kind of critical, and it's kind of overseen most of the time when you talk about health information, PHIs, and information of that sort. I find that having the right data set is kind of critical, and then making sure that the right data is kind of conserved in a way that kind of protects the privacy of an individual is kind of necessary too. And anonymization of data is kind of a key factor about the redaction and the curation aspect of how the data is kind of handled and how you take care of it, and making sure you kind of comply with all the rules and regulation is very critical in my aspect. And definitely touching back on Patrick's point about ethical use of data, making sure it's kind of doing the right thing at the pace that it's kind of used at the intended effect or the results, kind of very important too. So probably with that, I'll kind of close up my thoughts there. Thanks for the opportunity, and feel free to add me on LinkedIn if anyone wants to. Sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm just going to say thanks to everyone. However you want to do your clap of hands, whether it's to turn off the mic and actually do this, or this, or whatever you want to do. I want to thank everybody for this. This was really well done. I appreciate it. I'll pass the ball back to you, Raj, and I'm very happy to have participated. Thanks for letting me go a couple minutes over, because it was hard when I was hearing the answers not to want to learn more. So you guys did fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitchell, and thank you all the speakers for making it on a Saturday morning and afternoon from East Coast to West Coast. Very, very, very educational. And I also felt drinking from the hose at some point, there's a lot to absorb as well. So thanks for Mitchell for clarifying that some of those points for the audience. And there's a survey link that was shared in the chat. So this is organized by the team of volunteers helping each other, so encourage people to join project management world and help enhance the quality of it even further. And with that, we would conclude. Just wanted to one more time share that there's a white paper being going out to all the attendees on combining AI and behavioral science responsibly. And then one of the lucky draw will get the project management skills for all careers book. And Mitchell mentioned about his offer as well. And then the tiny URL will share it with everybody. Thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Great job. Have a great rest of the weekend.
You too. Bye.
Thank you, too.